Hey everybody, let's talk a little bit about captions and cut lines. What we're talking about when we talk about captions and cut lines is the little bit of information that comes underneath a photograph. So those of you who are interested in photography and how that overlays with journalism, here's an important piece of journalistic writing that goes along with that skill. First of all, let's get really specific and pedantic for just a minute. You'll notice that throughout this presentation I'll sort of go back and forth talking about captions and cut lines interchangeably. So the question may be, are they the same thing? Technically, the space that's given to the words in the caption itself is the caption. It's sort of the way we talk about the layout, whereas the cut line are the words themselves. So for example, in this, the space underneath the photograph is called the caption, whereas the words, the Savannah City Council went over some potential funding options during the first day of a 2-day budget workshop on Thursday, is the cut line. Now I'm going to use these two terms interchangeably because this is sort of an old-fashioned approach to it. Just so you know, if you move on to news editing and design as a class, you won't be confused because of that. Okay, let's talk about the basic structure of a caption. A caption is going to have two sentences, so a basic cut line is 2 sentences long. You'll notice that one that I just used as an example was not 2 sentences long, and that's because it is bad and poorly done. Okay, so captions are 2 sentences long, and each sentence has a very distinct purpose. The first sentence describes what is going on in the photograph. It's literally going to just describe what you're looking at. It is either going to be in present tense or future tense, and you can use past tense sparingly, but the default here is almost always present tense. So it describes what's in the photograph and is present tense. The second sentence, and remember there's only 2 sentences, it's going to bring up some deeper element of the story that you couldn't just know by looking at the photograph, and it should be in past tense normally. So let's look at some examples and look at some photographs with some captions that go along with them. These are all from a photo story that has to do with some dirt track riders on motorcycles in South Africa. So here, pretty cool photograph. There's the motorcycle going around a corner. So the cut line for this will say, Speedway racer Neil Pettit power slides his motorbike into the corner during a race at the Walkerville Dirt Oval south of Johannesburg, South Africa, on August 28. Notice the first sentence literally just tells you what the picture was. It is a picture of someone power sliding a motorbike into the corner. The second sentence, Speedway racing seats 4 to 6 racers riding against each other around an oval dirt racetrack on motorbikes that don't have brakes or gears. Just by looking at that photograph, I would have no idea that that motorcycle doesn't have brakes and doesn't have gears. So the second sentence acts as a little bit more detailed information. It acts as a little extra piece of context to describe what's going on. All right, let's look at some more examples from this same photo story. Here's a guy hanging out. He's got his helmet on his head, smoking a cigarette. The caption, Mario van der Merwe smokes a cigarette prior to his speedway heat at the Walkerville Dirt Oval. That is exactly what is going on in the photograph. Second sentence, the newly formed Staff Cop sees normal motorbike racers taking to the dirt oval racetrack to race against each other in different categories. A little piece of information, a little piece of context I would not otherwise know. This works the same way if there's a photograph without any people in it. So here we have an example. This is just a photograph of a motorcycle. And the caption would read, an old Yamaha has good luck painted on the tank at the Walkerville Dirt Oval for the first race of the Stuff Cop race day south of Johannesburg on August 6. Although there were small prizes, the racing was about having fun, beating your friends, and getting a face full of dirt. Notice that the first sentence, again, describes exactly what is going on in the photograph, and the second sentence gives you a little bit more information. I would have no idea that there were small prizes just by looking at that picture of the motorcycle. This is one of my favorite little photographs from this photo story or from this photo package. This is of sidecar racers, which is the most bonkers form of motorsports I've ever seen. And the caption is, a sidecar racer hangs off the edge of the motorbike as his friend steers the bike around the Walkerville Dirt Oval. Sidecar racing is very dangerous as the passenger needs to hang off the bike to keep it stable. So, I probably didn't necessarily need to be told that it was dangerous to know that it was dangerous just based off that photo, but it is a little bit of information extra. And finally, here's a photograph of a guy on a motorcycle with a little bit of motor blur or motion blur around it to give it a sense of speed. And the cut line says, Andrew Wessels races his Ducati Scrambler during the Staff Cop race meeting at the Walkerville Dirt Oval. That's exactly what's in the photograph. Wessels, at 63, was one of the oldest competitors. I wouldn't know that simply by looking at the photograph. Also, check out the verbs here. Andrew Wessels races being the present tense verb in the first sentence, and Wessels at 63 ends up being the past tense verb in the second sentence. So some more rules to talk about here. Generally, one of the things you should have noticed that we were doing as we went along this example is that generally people are going to be identified by their first and last name, along with any titles that they may need in the first sentence. And if you bring them up again in the second sentence, you just use their last name. Now, one of the biggest questions that I get with caption writing is how do you do identification if there's more than one person in the photograph? The thing is there's no real set in stone rule or style in the AP style book for this kind of thing. And everywhere you work is going to have some special rule or in-house rule for that. So all I can really do is teach you the way that I used to do it when I worked for newspapers. So here's what we would do. If there were only 2 people in the shop, I would integrate it into the text itself. And what I mean by that is this. Bob Belcher left puts a burger on the grill, while Linda Belcher right takes another order from a customer. Notice that I have integrated the left and right into the text itself and offset it with commas. So we are indicating that that is where that needs to be. This is what I would do for, again, if it was only 2 people. Now, if there was more people, if there was 3 or more people, what I would do is go from left. That would be sort of the way that I would indicate that in the caption. So it'd say from left, Greg Tilapia, Patty Salmon, and Reggie Trout, owners of the Railroad Diner, get the restaurant ready for another day. The reason we go left to right is because that's the way that the human eye, the human brain reads, at least in English. So that's sort of the way that we would do that, and that sort of from left goes until you get to maybe 6 or 7 people, or when it starts to become just too much to try to list every single person in the photograph, in which case you kind of switch over and then just call them by a group name, such as the club or the class or the organization. We want to make sure we're not making judgment calls in photo captions and photo cut lines. Like, we shouldn't be the one making decisions like that. So, for example, if we might be tempted to put a caption that says, an unhappy citizen watches the protest in the town square on Monday. But, what if that person's just having a really bad day and that's why they're frowning? What if their cat ran away earlier that morning and so they're really sad about it? Or what if that's just the way their face looks? Maybe they just naturally have a frowny face. We don't need to be making judgment calls saying that they're unhappy. We want to make sure that we're being careful with the way we structure the date in the first sentence of the caption, because occasionally we can make it sound a little bit funny. So an example here, a former soldier smokes Monday in the one-time Khmer Rouge stronghold of Palan, Cambodia, near the Thai border. The problem is that, the way that you have put the word Monday in the caption makes it sound as if it's like a strain of marijuana or something. The date normally goes at the end of the sentence when we're talking about captions and cut lines. And as always, we want to make sure that we're avoiding biased language. So just like in a story, you would want to avoid any sort of bias along with it. You want to make sure in a cut line you're not saying something like, Representative Larry Kissel voted against healthcare reform, even though it's badly needed in the largely rural district he represents. That second bit there is a little bit of a judgment call that we really shouldn't be making either in the body of a story or in a cut line or caption. If you're ever asked to take pictures of or to go photograph an event that you may not be super familiar with, either the context of the event, or if it's a sporting event you're not familiar with, or it's in a town that you're not familiar with, try to get someone to help you identify things that maybe needs identifying, maybe things that need clarifying, so that you don't make yourself look silly at times when you're captioning things. So my favorite example of this is from a couple of years ago. This is from a British sports site. Those of you who know already that I'm a fan of Formula One racing, so this is one of my favorite. the caption here on the side, David Beckham poses with an elderly fan at the Singapore Grand Prix, which is fine if, you kind of don't notice the fact that the quote-unquote elderly fan that he's taking a picture with is in fact Niki Lauda, a famous driver who won 3 national championships or international championships in the 1970s and 80s. As a matter of fact, he's so famous that there was a movie made about him a couple of years ago. If someone's famous enough to have a movie made about them, don't call them an elderly fan in a caption. So the big challenge here is to be active with your verbs, to be active with your descriptions, to try to avoid being vague in the way that you set things up. And that's tricky sometimes, because sometimes things are just not interesting. But, for example, this caption here, Carl Edwards celebrates one of his victories that helped him win the Richard Petty Driver of the Year award. Celebrates is such a weak verb here. Like, if you have someone backflipping off of a race car, you should probably use backflipping off of a race car in your description of what the photo is. Like, otherwise, you're just going to make yourself look boring and silly. So we want to make sure we're avoiding boring, obvious generalities that are just there to fill up space. So, for example, we want to avoid stuff like person gestures to the crowd. People gesture all the time. It's not interesting. Talk about what they were talking about to the crowd. This is a baseball one from a long time ago. It always stuck out to me and I saved it, which is Buck Showalter is introduced as the Orioles manager while president of baseball operations Andy MacPhail looks on. Like, never use looks on. We spend our whole lives looking on. No one thinks that's interesting. Avoid that kind of language. We only need to talk about who's in the foreground of the picture, not the background. That's a typo. Just avoid that. Sorry about that. There's 2 sort of cardinal sins to writing captions, and that are these 2. Never use is shown or is pictured in a caption or cut line, because you're not actually describing what's in the picture. You're simply saying that it is a picture, and that's kind of cheating, right? Like, that's not actually the way to make a description. So these were so bad, I used to just straight up ban them from the paper I used to work for. You were not allowed to do that. They're completely worthless. They give you no context, no description, no information at all. They're just awful. Now, the reason why this is so difficult to do is because a lot of the time photos are not going to be action-packed, right? Not every one of them is going to be someone backflipping off of a race car. Occasionally, you're going to get boring photos, and you're going to have the challenge of making them interesting. So consider for a second the grip and grin, as we call it. The grip and grin is one of the worst photo styles ever known to man, and I'm sure you've probably seen one of these before. It's when someone hands someone else an award and pauses for a photograph and shakes their hand. The thing is that the reason these are so awful and boring is that they end up with really boring captions, like Bob Smith smiles as he's handed an award. Who cares? No one cares. So why not consider making the award the centerpiece of the caption? Bob Smith, a Dullesville Police Department officer, receives the Good Citizen Award from Dave Jones after saving an entire litter of kittens that was trapped in a tree. So we actually make it about the award itself. You can also, if it's a ceremonial thing, right, you can make something about the item itself that is being talked about. So anytime you're in a situation where somebody's giving someone else a giant check for charity reasons, make it, about what the check itself will do. So a $500 check that Chamber of Commerce President Judy Smith left hands to Kiwanis Club President John Howard Wright will provide toys for the needy children. So talk about what the impact of the check will actually be instead of just the fact that it is a check. And finally, the caption talks about, or sort of goes to, the focal subject of the photograph, not the biggest thing in the photograph. So geographically, the biggest thing in this photograph is this enormous lighthouse. But that's not really why you're there, that's not why you're taking the picture, and that's not what you're going to caption. Instead, you're going to focus on the people, and say, dozens gather near the shore in Waterville to view the full moon coming up over the horizon on Sunday. All right, well, hopefully you have learned something or two about captions and cutlines, because there will be a question or two on the exam about them. If you have any questions, please let me know.